Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be back after 12 years. Israel Shamir and I are going to engage in what we in America call the good cop, bad cop routine. But I'm not going to tell you who's the good cop and who is the bad cop. You're going to have to figure that out. In 2005, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, the Vatican II document on other religions, which has really become known as the Vatican II document on the Jews. And perhaps celebration isn't the right word. As part of this memorial, Yonah Metzger, Israel's chief Ashkenazi rabbi, wrote in the Jesuit magazine, America, that in Nostra Aetate, the church rejected the normative view of Jews that had been held throughout Christendom for many centuries, namely, and this is what he said, that the Jews rejected Christ and were guilty of the crime of deicide, and consequently they had been rejected by the Creator in favor of Christians who were the new Israel. That was all rejected according to Rabbi Metzger. He went on to say that this attitude of what he called supersessionism and the teaching of contempt laid the groundwork for centuries of discrimination, persecution, and violence against Jews. And this is his quote, culminating in the Shoah, in which 1/3 of Jewry was murdered. This tragedy, he continued, impelled a major transformation in Christian teaching toward Jews. The Holocaust became European Christianity's most terrible source of guilt, not because the murderers were pious or because church leaders have been entirely silent about the laws and actions of the Nazis over the years, but because of the undeniable record of anti-Semitism in the church's teachings over the centuries. Not only ignorant peasants or monks, but also eminent theologians and spiritual teachers had attacked the Jews as the killers of Christ, as a people now abandoned by God, a race deserving not its envied wealth, but revenge for plots and acts against innocent Christians. Not only, he continued, had the Jews of Rome been forced to live in a ghetto until the Pope no longer governed that city, but almost everywhere in Europe, Jews had been made to seem strange, sinister, and repulsive. A long road of disgraceful preaching was one of the paths across the centuries which led to the Nazis' death camps, and in the end, not Judaism, but Christianity was discredited. When it comes to Catholic-Jewish dialogue, this view was the rule and not the exception. In his book, A Moral Reckoning, the role of the Catholic Church in the Holocaust and its unfulfilled duty of repair, Daniel Jonah Goldhagen wrote, for centuries, the Catholic Church harbored anti-Semitism as its core, as an integral part of its doctrine, its theology, and its liturgy. Now, Nostra Aetate celebrations are not typical of Catholic-Jewish relations because during the Nostra Aetate celebrations, the Jews were being irenic. So in many ways, this was to look for the normal Catholic-Jewish relations, we have to look where they were not being irenic. And a good example of that might be the reaction to the Oberammergau Passion Play. Jewish organizations had tried to stop performances of the Passion Play beginning in the 1930s, but they never gained any traction until Nostra Aetate, the document I just mentioned. Rabbi James Rudin of the American Jewish Congress mentioned the positive teachings of the Second Vatican Council in 1965 as his biggest ally. In his book on Oberammergau, James Shapiro claims that Nostra Aetate reversed close to 2,000 years of church teaching about the collective responsibility of Jews for Jesus' death. In his book on Oberammergau, James Shapiro says the American Jewish Committee boycott would have gotten nowhere without Nostra Aetate. Without a dramatic turn in the teachings of the Catholic Church, Jewish protesters would not have had much success in changing the play, boycotts notwithstanding. The thinly veiled aggression behind Jewish enthusiasm for conciliar documents like Nostra Aetate becomes apparent when Shapiro claims, quote, it was only after Oberammergau was caught between the anvil of Vatican II and the hammering criticisms of Jewish groups that serious changes were grudgingly made. The point that Shapiro is making here is that the Bavarians were getting hammered, and that they were only getting hammered because of Nostra Aetate. Without this document, the Catholics would have been united and could have easily deflected the Jewish blows. So as the comedians would say, 40 years after Nostra Aetate, there is good news and bad news. The good news is that the Catholics can now engage in dialogue with the Jews. The bad news is that when they do, they learn that the Catholic Church is the most wicked institution in all of human history because it has preached racial hatred for 2,000 years and was responsible as well for the murder of Jews under Hitler during World War II. If the Catholic Church is guilty as charged, it's not clear why Jews would want to engage in dialogue, but that, I think, will become clear later on. In the meantime, Nostra Aetate gets twisted by the celebratory dialogue into saying what it does not say. Metzger claimed that Nostra Aetate affirmed the divine covenant with the Jewish people, that the divine covenant with the Jewish people remains unbroken. He also claims that it condemned what he calls supersessionism, but Nostra Aetate in fact states that the Church is the new people of God, which in fact means that the old people of God, the old Israel, has been superseded by the Church. As some indication that the Church is the new Israel and that Judaism cannot fulfill its covenant, Nostra Aetate goes on to say that it is the duty of the Church, therefore, in her preaching, to proclaim the cross of Christ as the sign of God's universal love and the source of all grace. As to responsibility for Christ's death, Nostra Aetate affirms what historically the Gospel of John says in 7:1, namely the Jews were out to kill him. But it affirms it in an oblique way when it says that neither all Jews indiscriminately at that time nor Jews today can be charged with crimes committed during his passion. Having studied logic, I take that passage to mean that some Jews at that time were guilty of the murder of Christ. Now, who were they? Does this mean that the beloved disciple and the Blessed Mother were out to kill Christ? They were Jews after all, weren't they? Does this mean that the beloved disciple and the Blessed Mother cried out, "Crucify him"? No. It means that they weren't Jews. It means that by the end of the Gospel, the word Jew is largely redefined as a rejecter of Christ, a definition which holds good both for Jews and Christians today. So there is no occult blood curse invoked in Matthew 27:25. What the Jews expressed when they cried, "His blood be on us and on our children," was rejection of Christ, a rejection which has persisted to this day among the Jews. That rejection was so vehement and so visceral that the Jews who voiced it demanded Christ's death as its ultimate expression. Similarly, when Nostra Aetate states that Jews should not be spoken of as rejected or accursed as if this followed from Scripture, that statement must be understood in the light of tradition. Because, as Cardinal Newman reminds us, while God's call always remains to Jews and Gentiles, their sin is their punishment, for in rejecting their divine king, they ipso facto lost the living principle and tie to their nationality. So tonight, having said that, I'd like to explore two pillars of Catholic-Jewish dialogue 40 years and some years after Nostra Aetate. Number one, the claim that the Catholic Church is intrinsically anti-Semitic. And number two, the claim that Catholic anti-Semitism is responsible for the death of Jews under Hitler during World War II. Let's begin with the Gospel of St. John. Taking part in an evangelical Jewish dialogue on the Gospel of St. John, which was held at the Evangelical Academy of Arnoldstein in Germany in 1989, Micha Brumlich, one of the Jewish participants, got quickly to the point. How is dialogue possible when the irreducible kernel of the gospel is intrinsically anti-Jewish? If the Gospel of St. John is what Brumlich claims that it is, namely an embassy of hate, or as he put, eine Botschaft des Hasses, then the real issue is not interfaith dialogue, but the identity of Christianity itself. If the Gospel of St. John is normative for Christianity, and it would be hard to see how this is not the case, then either Christianity is a religion of hate, and there's no point in engaging in dialogue with its adherents, or Christians must be anti-Jewish. Brumlich chooses the first option and engages in dialogue after all, but only to denounce the foundational writings of Christianity as hate speech. In the Gospel of St. John, he writes, the message, this is a direct quote, my translation, but a direct quote, the message that is supposed to lead the people by way of faith and the sons of the Father is in reality a message of marginalization, fear, anxiety, and hate. There is no other scripture in the New Testament in which Christianity more fully achieves its non-Jewish identity, and there is no other scripture in which the marginalization of Jews, and by that I mean Judaism, is achieved in such a sharp, irreconcilable, and unbridgeable manner as in the Gospel according to John. St. John achieves this by portraying all Jews at all levels as both in the form of the spontaneous mob as well as in the form of the political religious leadership as murderers, assassins, and killers. Even the Jews who believed in Jesus, insofar as they wanted to remain Jews, have to hear themselves denounced as children of the devil. Brumlich then contradicts himself by calling the Gospel of John proto-racist. We see here an example of the ambiguity surrounding the term anti-Semitism, a term which Jews like Brumlich are never going to clear up. The heart of the matter, as far as Brumlich is concerned, lies in chapter 8 of the Gospel of St. John, a document which he sees as, quote, proto-racist and manifesting, quote, politically and socio-psychologically explainable delusions, which are then tied together in a consistent Satanology which demonizes the Jews and gives them no chance. According to Brumlich's reading, St. John portrays the Jews as a group of people who don't recognize Jesus as the Son of God because they are ontologically and constitutionally incapable of recognizing him as such. This is part and parcel, according to his view, of the satanic nature of the Jews. They can't recognize him, and so they must persecute him. Why don't you understand what I am saying? This is Jesus now speaking. Because you can't hear my word. The devil is your father, and you prefer to do what your father wants. He was a murderer from the start and was never grounded in the truth. There is no truth in him at all. Now, I read this passage in Prague in 2004, and a report came out afterwards, and the headline of the report was, Jones says Jews are children of Satan. No, I'm sorry, I didn't say that. Jesus Christ is what I was quoting, and you twisted this around into something that I made up. I didn't say that. I don't want to claim credit for the words of our Lord and Savior. Jew, however, is not primarily a racial term in the Gospel of St. John. It is primarily a religious term. Anti-Semitism is a racial concept. Jesus goes out of his way to reject, in fact, Jewish racism and an essentially racial understanding of the term Jew in one of his confrontations with the Jews. When the Jews tell Jesus in John 8 that they are the, quote, seed of Abraham, in Greek sperma Abraham, he changes the terms of the argument by replying, if you were Abraham's children, you would do as Abraham did. Which is to say, they would reject, which is to say they would not reject Jesus as the Son of God and Messiah. Since the Jews reject Jesus, they reject their father Abraham as well, and show the devil is your father. Again, the quote from our Lord. In other words, Jesus doesn't, he obliquely confronts this racial claim by changing the terms of the argument. The issue is not what your DNA is. The issue is whether you're acting like a child of God. A child can act, but DNA is a chemical. Once Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, Jew is no longer a purely racial term because the Jews now have to either accept him or reject him as the Messiah. At the beginning of the Gospel of St. John, Jesus says to the Samaritan woman, salvation comes from the Jews. Well, that's an ethnic racial term, okay? But we're in the process. Over the course of the Gospel, the term hoi judeoi changes in definition. The Jews who accept Jesus will henceforth be known as Christians or the new Israel. The Jews who reject him are henceforth known as the Jews. Or as John says in the Apocalypse, those who call themselves Jews are really liars and should be henceforth known as the synagogue of Satan. The redefinition of the word Jew becomes even more apparent in the story of the man born blind in John 9. The man's parents, we are told, refused to answer any questions about Jesus healing their son because they feared the Jews. They spoke like this out of fear of the Jews, who had already agreed to expel from the synagogue anyone who would acknowledge Jesus as the Christ. Well, why did they fear the Jews? They were Jews, weren't they? Well, no. By this point in the gospel, the term Jew has been redefined. Okay? It is obvious that they too were Jews, but it is also obvious that the term hoi judeoi cannot have a racial meaning at this point. Once again, it is worth pointing out that the Gospels are not and cannot be construed as anti-Semitic, because as Caron points out in his book, Qui sont les Juifs de l'Évangile de Jean, it's clear that the expression does not consider the totality of the Jewish people. Jews and his disciples, like John the Baptist, are also Jews. The term Jew, again, according to Caron, is not used in an ethnic or racial sense. The Gospels cannot be anti-Semitic because the antagonists are both Semites. The Gospels do not espouse hatred of individuals because of their race, and indeed it would be impossible to do so because the Christians portrayed in the Gospels are all Jews. This does not preclude, however, the fact that the Gospels are anti-Jewish, and that is precisely the issue that we have to face now, depending on how one defines that term. Brumlich helps us here when he says, Jews, in fact, all Jews, insofar as they are Jews, which is to say, insofar as they hold fast to their position as children of Abraham, are essentially damned enemies of Jesus. Jesus would probably object to this portrayal of the Jews, not because he felt that they weren't damned, no one who rejects Christ can be saved, but because Brumlich portrays the Jews as being loyal children of Abraham, a contention which Jesus specifically rejects in John 8:37 when he says to the Jews, if you were Abraham's children, you would do as Abraham did. So at this point, certain issues become clear. The Gospel of St. John is not and cannot be construed as anti-Semitic, but is it, as Brumlich would say, Judenfeindlich? Is it anti-Jewish? The answer is yes. The Gospels are anti-Jewish, but not anti-Semitic, because over the course of Jesus' public ministry, as described in the Gospel of St. John, the Jews essentially defined themselves as rejectors of Christ. And so a Christian, by definition, must be therefore a rejecter of the rejection of Christ. In the Church's understanding, the Jews are primarily a theological construct. They get their essentially negative identity through rejection of Christ. The coming of Christ changed Jewish identity forever, something that the Jews at his time could comprehend only with difficulty. From this moment on, the term Israelite and Jew were no longer synonymous. As Ferdinand Hahn points out in the book that's already cited by Caron, the true Israelites are precisely those who, like Nathanael, recognize in Jesus the Messiah. So let's sum up here then. Both Daniel Goldhagen and Misha Brumlich are right if we define our terms properly. But in doing that, we have to reject their main contention. The Church is not and cannot be anti-Semitic, because the term primarily refers to race and racial hatred. The Gospel of St. John does not promote hatred. The Church cannot promote racial hatred of Jews because its founder was part of that racial group. However, the Gospel of St. John makes clear that there is a deep and abiding rejection of the rejection of Christ. This Judenfeindlichkeit, or this anti-Jewish attitude, is part of the essence of Catholicism. It has to be. The Church must be opposed to the belief of the Jews insofar as the Jews have defined themselves as rejectors of Christ. Now, why did the Jews reject Christ? They rejected Christ because he was crucified. They wanted a powerful leader, not a suffering servant. Annas and Caiaphas mockingly told Christ at the foot of the cross that if he came down from the cross, they would accept him as the political Messiah that the masses had hoped he might be. The Pharisees, who still believed in a final resurrection, seemed to think that God's plan was not a gratuitous gift from above, but was somehow due to the Jews as their right. Because Christ is the physical manifestation of Logos, those Jews who rejected Christ became revolutionaries, because Logos includes within it both the moral and political order of the universe. If you go to a Greek dictionary and look up the word Logos, you will find page upon page of definitions of what this entails. But we're talking about the order of the universe. Recently, when the Pope gave his talk, which was primarily portrayed as an attack on Muslims, he talked about Logos. And he talked about the fact that Christianity and Logos, the Greek term Logos, became inseparable when St. John wrote the Gospel in Greek. There's no de-Hellenization of Christianity. It's impossible, so don't even try it. It's an illusion. And what are we talking about? We're talking about the first sentence of the Gospel, which is Ein Arche, Ein Ha Logos. In the beginning there was. The word is translated, but that's not an adequate translation. In the beginning there was Logos. There was this order to the universe from the very beginning, and this man is the living manifestation of that order. And if you reject him, you reject the order of the universe. And that includes the social, the moral order, and the political order. So Jews became revolutionaries at the foot of the cross, but the full implication of their decision didn't become apparent until 30 years later, when the Jews rebelled against Rome, and Rome retaliated by destroying the temple. At that point, the Jews had no temple, no priesthood, and no sacrifice, and as a result, they had no way of fulfilling their covenant. Seeing which way the battle for Jerusalem was going, a rabbi by the name of Yochanan ben Zakkai had himself smuggled out of Jerusalem in a shroud, and after being recognized by Titus as a friend of Rome, was granted the privilege of founding a rabbinical school at Yavne. It is at this moment, some 30 years after the founding of the church, that modern Judaism as we know it, was born as essentially a debating society. Because in the absence of a temple, that was all the Jews could do. The results of these interminable debates became known as the Talmud, which got written down over the next 6 centuries. This debating did nothing to eradicate the spirit of revolution from the Jews. In many ways, it intensified it by teaching the Jews to look for a military Messiah. The Jews got their military Messiah roughly 60 years after the destruction of the temple, when Simon Bar Kokhba rose up against Rome in 131 AD. The rabbis in Jerusalem, with almost no exceptions, recognized Bar Kokhba as the Messiah, and just as if to prove that racial Judaism had become extinct, the Christian Jews were expelled for not recognizing him as the Messiah. In other words, Judaism is an ideology now. It's a revolutionary ideology. If you don't go along, accept this man as the Messiah, you're not a Jew. You're out of here. So in a sense, the Jews are confirming what St. John has already said. Didn't much matter whether your mother was Jewish. The ultimate determinant of Jewishness has become rejection of Christ, and that rejection of Logos led inexorably to revolution. When they rejected Jesus Christ, the Jews became revolutionaries. Rome crushed the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and an anti-Semitic reaction spread throughout the Middle East. Hadrian set up extermination camps for the men, and so many Jewish women and children were sold into slavery that the bottom fell out of the market. When Jewish revolutionaries rose up and slaughtered 100,000 Greeks on the island of Cyprus, the Greeks responded by slaying every Jew on the island and passing a law banning them from ever setting foot on the island again. Not even shipwrecked Jews were allowed into Cyprus. Similar reactions to Jewish revolutionary behavior happened in Alexandria. As a result of Kokhbar's crushing defeat at the hands of the Romans, Jewish revolutionary activity went dormant for about 1,000 years. Rome fell in 410. The Edict of Constantine had been issued roughly 100 years before. In order to understand the Catholic response to the Jews, we need to examine a period when Catholics had political power. not when Germany was in the grip of what Pope Benedict has called a neo-pagan ideology, otherwise known as Nazism. The Catholic response to the Jewish problem in medieval Europe was called Sicut Judaeus Non, a doctrine codified by Pope Gregory the Great and reiterated by virtually every pope, every medieval pope after him. Bernard of Clairvaux epitomizes the approach to the Jews known as Sicut Judaeus Non when one of his monks was involved in the pogroms against the Jews that accompanied the Second Crusade. Rudolph, this renegade monk, refused to obey Bernard until Bernard, risking his own life in the process, confronted him and ordered it back to his monastery. Jews are carnal and blind, said Bernard, but no one has the right to harm them. Jewish belief is a night, and night too is the fleshly or bestial way of life led by Catholics. Those Catholics who engaged in usury, according to Benedict, played the Jew to their co-religionists. So it's clear that this is an ideology that anyone can adopt. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Jew, or to act like a Jew. None of this rhetoric was calculated to endear Bernard to the Jews, but none of it was new either. Bernard praised the Christians who wished to go forth against the Ishmaelites, but he warned them, as he warned Rudolph, that whoever touches a Jew so as to lay hands on his life does something sinful, as if he laid hands on Jesus himself. The Jewish chronicler Ephraim Bar Jacob mentions in this context Bernard's denunciation of my disciple Rudolph. In speaking against the Jews to exterminate them, Rudolph has preached only unrighteousness. If, however, the Jews promoted violence against Christians, then Bernard held it would be right to match force with force in self-defense. So Sicut Judaeus Non is a twofold thing. Just as no one is allowed to hurt the Jews, so the Jews should not presume to undermine the Christian commonwealth by subverting the faith or morals of the Christian people. It's sort of, you do your part and we'll do our part. The other part of it is Jewish converts are to be accepted without calumny, which is in many ways proof of the anti-racial aspect of the church's teaching. You could have a howling mob chase a Jew through the town, and if the Jew made it into the church and was baptized, he walked back out, and that was the end of the story. Because the church, this culture, based on a Christian understanding of the Jew, understood that the Jewishness was based on rejection of Christ. And if the Jew rejected the rejection, he was not a Jew anymore. He was one of us and should be accepted without calumny. This was the situation, as I said, for 1,000 years. The 1,000 years reign of Christ on earth probably was from 410 to 1410. That's a totally idiosyncratic interpretation of that, but it occurred to me. Then the revolutionary spirit reasserted itself in Europe at the time when Jan Hus was excommunicated. Many Jewish commentators have noticed the underlying congruity between Talmudic Judaism and revolution. Heinrich Graetz, the father of Jewish historiography, is one of them. Calling Hus a Czech priest who has loosened the bonds in the church that ensnared the minds of men, Graetz goes on to note that the flames fired a multitude in Bohemia who entered on a life and death struggle with Catholicism. Whenever a party in Christendom opposes itself to the ruling church, it assumes a tinge of the Old Testament, not to say Jewish spirit. Again, this is the father of Jewish historiography. The Hussites regarded Catholicism not unjustly as heathenism and therefore as Israelites, which must wage holy war against the Philistines, Moabites, and Ammonites. Church and monasteries were to them the sanctuaries of a dissolute idolatry, temples to Baal and Moloch, and groves to Ashtaroth to be consumed with fire and sword. Hus was accused of conspiring with Jews, and the accusation would discredit the movement in the eyes of the Orthodox from then on. Most of the evidence in this regard comes from Jewish sources. Rabbi Louis Israel Newman claims that the Hussite Revolution was a conspiracy between Hussites, Waldensians, and Jews. Another word for this type of Judaizing is messianic politics or revolution. Eventually, the revolutionary spirit made its way to England, where it flared up in the middle of the 17th century. In order to become revolutionaries, Englishmen first had to become Jews. By engaging in revolution, Christians, like the Puritans, hoped to bring about heaven on earth, but what they brought about instead was, in Archbishop Laud's words, the terrene kingdom of the Jews. The Puritan reign in England was no exception to that rule. As Archbishop Laud made clear in a sermon in 1621, it was precisely this error of the Jews that the Puritans were bent on resurrecting. The Puritans, according to Laud, inclined to Judaism as the new sect of the Thraskites and other opinionists concerning the terrene kingdom of the Jews. Taking the Jews who had rejected Christ on the cross as their model, their Puritan revolutionary co-belligerents now announced the advent of the kingdom of God on earth, or in Laud's terms, as I said, the terrene kingdom of the Jews in England. Heaven on earth was now to be instituted by a government of English saints at some point in the decade following 1650. Since one of the inaugural events of the coming of this new kingdom was the murder of the English king, it promised to be a bloody kingdom for those with the eyes capable of seeing it, but a kingdom nonetheless, and a worldly kingdom as well, in which sainthood was the first job requirement for every politician. On January 30th, 1649, 8 months after Bogdan Chmielnicki had defeated the Polish army, while the slaughter of Jews was in full swing, the Puritan demi-Jews presided over the execution of the English king. His death warrant was signed by 59 saints. Cromwell's name was third on the list. One commentator claimed that the execution of the kings was an earth-shattering event. He would have done better to call the regicide world-shattering, because it shattered a number of worlds, all of them Jewish, all of them medieval. Both the Jew and the demi-Jew presided at the birth of a new age, an age seen by both of them as the dawn of redemption. That new age, and the Jewish-Puritan alliance at its heart, is with us still, driving American foreign policy, to a recent example of its activity, to war in Iraq. Like all the wars it spawns, that new age would turn out to be every bit as bloody as the events which inaugurated. Cromwell made use. The only way Cromwell could justify what he did was by appealing to the Old Testament. It was the only source of authority at this point that was capable of dealing with that would justify the break with the church. You'll find that Milton does the same thing. If you read Milton's treatise on divorce, it's another example of different kind of appetite. Milton wanted to marry another woman. There's a clear prescription against divorce and remarriage in the Gospels, and so Milton just appealed to Moses. And then the appeal to Moses then led him from one step to the other, where to the point where suddenly the English were now God's chosen people. Messianic politics had now turned the English nation into the successor of the Jews. The church has disappeared. There is no new Israel now. Now there is another national entity. And in this, what we see here is a reversion to what St. Bernard of Clairvaux would call the vomit of Judaism, a reversion to an earlier form, a more primitive form. Suddenly there's no separation of pope or emperor. Suddenly they're both together. One man now, Cromwell, is the new David, and he holds both swords in his hand. Okay? Grace, of course, the father of Jewish historiography, noticed the same thing in the Puritans that he noticed in the Hussites. The Christian Bible, with its monkish figures, its exorcists, its praying brethren, and pietistic saints, supplied no model for warriors contending with a faithless king, a false aristocracy, and unholy priest. Only the great heroes of the Old Testament, with fear of God in their hearts and the sword in their hands, at once religious and national champions, could serve as models for the Puritans. The judges, freeing the oppressed people from the yoke of domination, Saul, David, and Joab routing the foes of their country, and Jehu making an end to idolatrous and blasphemous house. These were the favorite characters of the Judaizers.
Right. Can somebody try those lights again?
One of those power cuts.
I need the lights up here too for this.
Yes, one of those. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Grace continues in every verse of the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. They saw their own condition reflected. Oliver Cromwell compared himself to the judge Gideon, who first obeyed the voice of God unhesitatingly, but afterwards courageously scattered the attacking heathens, or as Judas Maccabeus, who out of a handful of martyrs formed a host of victorious warriors. Grace puts his finger on the heart of the issue when he identifies Puritan role models as at once religious and national champions. The Puritans wanted to become Jews for the same reason that they wanted their visible elect on earth as a replacement for the state church. If they could absorb the Jews as a result of converting them to their form of Judaizing Christianity, they would be, just about every sense of the word, Jews themselves, the new chosen people, and England would be the new Jerusalem. Cromwell's attempt to bring the Jews into England was thwarted by one of the most effective tracts in the history of English letters, namely Prynne's Demurrer. In his Demurrer, Prynne put together what he described as a faithful compilation of the materials available in his day for a history of the Jews in England. That history included the stories or legends of the ritual murders of William of Norwich in 1144 and Little St. Hugh of Lincoln in 1255, in addition to a catalog of many lesser evils. In his Demurrer, Prynne claimed that the Jews had been expelled from England in 1290 for good reason. They had been formerly greater clippers and forgers of money and had crucified 3 or 4 children in England at least. As a result of the Jews' behavior then in the parlous state of religious life in England in the wake of revolution and regicide, Prynne concluded that now was a very ill time to bring in the Jews. Since the people of England were so dangerously and generally bent to apostasy and all sorts of novelties and errors in religion, it was much more likely that they would sooner turn Jews than the Jews Christians. Prynne's Demurrer had an even greater effect on public opinion, which by now had become weary of Puritan fanaticism and the civil discord it brought in its wake, than it did on the council which Cromwell was trying to persuade. Counselors on their way to their chambers met soldiers on the street who felt, we must now all turn Jews and there will be nothing left for the poor. Even Philo-Semites like Jocelyn were having second thoughts. He prayed the Lord would hasten the Jews' conversion because he feared the opposite might happen if the Jews gained admission to England. He was heartily afraid that the admission of the Jews would cause Englishmen to turn aside from Christ to Moses. Cromwell did his best for the Jews, but by the time of the final meeting of the council on December 1655, hope for readmission of the Jews to England was gone. With unintended irony, Pat says that one of the oddest features of this debate was the lack of Jews in England should have made a positive view of them possible.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry, I'm not done.
Can you make this little stop? I just want to piece. Then I look at
Given pause by Prynne's Demurrer, English common sense triumphed over Puritan ideology.
You want to what, sorry?
While many Englishmen felt that the Jews might be tolerated if suitable precautions could be devised, an equally large segment, if not a majority, of that population felt that if the Jews were admitted, they would seduce and cheat the English. Sensing which way public opinion, now consumed with hatred of Cromwell and Puritanism, was going, the wealthy Jews of Amsterdam, who had backed Manasseh ben Israel, changed horses in midstream, and without telling Rabbi Manasseh, they backed Charles' first restoration instead. The question here then that the English had to ask in the middle of the 17th century is now America's question in a sense, because we, unlike England, which had a repudiation of Puritanism, America has never repudiated Puritanism. We had in Boston at the beginning of the 18th century, you had Benjamin Franklin and Cotton Mather walking down the streets at the same time. American foreign policy, as a result, has alternated between the two poles of the Enlightenment and the Puritan age, sort of alternately, and right now in the throes of what I'd have to say was the Puritan phase, the phase of messianic politics. And so it's incumbent upon us to do what Prynne did in England at that time, to examine the situation and come up with some sense of the understanding of the Jew to the state, to the rest of us, and to the Christian religion. Who is our enemy here? Our enemy is the revolutionary Jew. The ideology that he espouses is the revolutionary Jewish spirit, which was created in a nutshell at the foot of the cross. Messianic politics instead of the cross as the role of patient suffering.
What a motherfucker.
He is not, this man is not our enemy because of some occult racial inheritance. The revolutionary Jew is our enemy because he has rejected Logos. This means that Jews, to the extent that they accept, honor, and revere Logos, are not our enemies. There are Jews who accept Logos fully by sincerely accepting baptism, and there are Jews who accept it in some lesser capacity by their docility to the truth. We know Jewish people like this, and they should not be excluded from our fellowship, especially since many of them have suffered at the hands of the Jews themselves. As the Gospel of St. John makes clear, the Jews became the Jews the minute they rejected Christ. As such, their primary identity is negative. The minute they rejected Logos, which means reason, order, speech, and word, they became revolutionaries, determined enemies of Christ.
Could you wait till question time, sir?
And the Christian social
Which will be in
order.
a few minutes.
30 years after rejecting Christ, the revolutionary Jew rose again. Having failed to destroy Rome, they attempted to destroy the Europe which St. Benedict created out of the ruins of the Roman Empire and to replace it with one of their many deadly utopias. What did Jerusalem under Simon Bar Kokhba, the Soviet Union under Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Radek, the short-lived Soviet republics of Bavaria under Kurt Eisner and Eugen Levin, Hungary under Bela Kun, the racial apartheid state known as Israel under people like Menachem Begin or Yitzhak Shamir, or the neocon Neverland known as free and democratic Iraq. What do all these things have in common? Death is what they have in common. Lots of people have to die to bring about the revolutionary Jews' version of heaven on earth. The West, which we seek to preserve, is based on docility to Logos, the order of the universe which makes discourse possible. The essence of Jewish messianic politics, which seeks to create heaven on earth, is rejection of Logos, not sacred or wicked DNA. The essence of the Jewish rejection of Logos is known as the Talmud, which is anti-Logos in every sense of the word, from hatred of Christ all the way down to rejection of the practical Logos that is known as morality. We saw a recent example of Talmudic thought during the 2006 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, when Charles Krauthammer and the Jewish Rabbinic Council attacked the just war theory, in particular its ban on killing non-combatants and the principle of proportionality, as a Christian idea, and therefore one which Jews did not have to follow. The principles of the just war theory are another word for civilized behavior. Those who refuse to be bound by them are barbarians and deserve to be treated as such. No country can implement Talmudic thought as our country has, I mean the United States, and not suffer the consequences that rejection of Logos necessarily bring with it. This point was made in 1890 in a series of articles that appeared in Civiltà Cattolica, just talking about the results. It was followed the 100th anniversary of the celebration of the French Revolution. in France. An analysis of what did 100 years of revolution mean to France. And the conclusion they came to was that any country that rebelled against God's law, as France had during the French Revolution, would end up being ruled by Jews. As a result of the revolution, this is the quote from there. As the result of the revolution, France awoke to find itself in bondage to the Jews. It is just this subjugation burdening the European peoples in economic, moral, and political aspects that constitutes the kernel of the Jewish question in our time. The main form of modern bondage is finance, and because of their ascendancy in finance, the Jews were able to extend their dominion of French culture to newspapers and education. The only country at this time,
Excuse me, sir, will you wait until...
The only country at this time that was mentioned as in Chiviltov...
to speak. Not now.
The only country that was mentioned in Civiltà Cattolica as not being under this yoke was Russia, as of this time. Solzhenitsyn viewed the Jewish contribution to the rise of the revolutionary spirit from a similar perspective that was not dissimilar to the explanation which the authors of Civiltà Cattolica proposed when he claimed, quote, "It is not Christian Europe which suffers under the Jews, it is unbelieving Europe which suffers." To the extent that we distance ourselves from our Christian roots, we will distance ourselves from the protection of the Christian order which that was created to bring about. This is the situation we find ourselves in today. We live in a post-revolutionary era in just about every country in Europe. The revolutions of 1890 only confirmed what the Jesuits said in 1890. What happened in France in 1789 happened in Russia in 1917. In the history of the Jews in Russia, Devesty let Fumesti, Alexander Solzhenitsyn claims that Jews dominated all of the revolutionary parties in Russia, a claim recently backed up by the works of Yuri Slezkine. There were more Jews among the Mensheviks and the Social Democrats than there were among the Bolsheviks. He also claims that after the Reds triumphed in the Civil War following the Revolution of 1917, Jews flooded into Moscow and Leningrad, where they formed the backbone of the new communist regime. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was bad enough, but it had nowhere near the psychological effect on public opinion that its daughter revolutions, the short-lived Soviet republics of Bavaria and Hungary, had on the populations of Eastern Europe. Bela Kun did for the Jews in Hungary what Kurt Eisner did for the Jews in Germany. Both men created a huge wave of anti-Semitism in both of their countries. The Catholic Church in general and the Jesuits in particular were the main opponents of the revolutionary movement in the period leading up to and following World War I. Augustine Cardinal Hlond, the primate of Poland, has been called an anti-Semite, yet when he issued his pastoral letter on morals on February 29, 1936, he was articulating not racial hatred, but the principles of Sicut Judaeus Non. Cardinal Hlond wrote in this pastoral letter, "So long as Jews remain Jews, a Jewish problem exists and will continue to exist. This question varies in intensity and degree from country to country. It is especially difficult in our country and ought to be the object of serious consideration." And then he says he will touch briefly on that, what he's talking about there. "It is a fact," he wrote, "that Jews are waging war against the Catholic Church, that they are steeped in free thinking and constitute the vanguard of atheism, the Bolshevik movement, and revolutionary activity. It is a fact that Jews have a corruptive influence on morals and that their publishing houses are spreading pornography. It is true that Jews are perpetrating fraud, practicing usury, and dealing in prostitution. It is true from a religious and ethical point of view, Jewish youth are having a negative influence on the Catholic youth in our schools. Now that's what gets quoted in all of the attacks on Cardinal Flaunt. What never gets quoted is the passage that I'm going to read to you now, which is a continuation from that passage. But let us be fair, Flaunt continues. Not all Jews are this way. There are very many Jews who are believing, honest, just, kind, and philanthropic. There is a healthy, edifying sense of family in many Jewish homes. We know Jews who are ethically outstanding, noble, and upright. He continues, I warn against that moral stance imported from abroad. Now here he's clearly referring to Germany. That is basically and ruthlessly anti-Jewish. It is contrary to Catholic ethics. One may love one's own nation more, but one may not hate anyone, not even Jews. One should stay away from the harmful moral influence of Jews, keep away from the anti-Christian culture, and especially boycott the Jewish press and demoralizing Jewish publications. But it is forbidden to assault, beat up, maim, or slander Jews. One should honor Jews as human beings and neighbors, even though we do not honor the indescribable tragedy of that nation, which was the guardian of the idea of the Messiah, and from which was born the Savior. When divine mercy enlightens a Jew to sincerely accept his and our Messiah, let us greet him into our Christian ranks with joy. Cardinal Flaunt was not expressing racial hatred here. He was warning his flock against the dangers of Bolshevism, which, as all of Europe had learned during the 20s, was an essentially Jewish phenomenon. Cardinal Flaunt was opposing Jewish revolutionary on one hand, but he was also opposing the vicious reaction to Jewish revolutionary activity that was known as Nazism and had taken over Germany at that time. The church was consistent in its opposition to revolution on one hand and in defending the Jews against physical harm on the other. Both parts of this teaching are necessary. If either one is ignored, trouble follows. The Catholic Church, in other words, had nothing to do with the rise of modern anti-Semitism. The main source of anti-Semitism was Jewish behavior. It was the most visible Jews, which is to say the ethnic religious Jews, who bore the brunt of that animus when the reaction came. The Trotskys make the revolution, but the Bronsteins pay for it, is how one Jew formulated the phenomenon. Modern anti-Semitism was in large part a reaction to Jewish Bolshevism. No one can deny that the church has been negligent in opposing Jewish revolutionary behavior over the past 40 years, but there are signs that behavior is changing. Number one, the prayer for the Good Friday service of January of this year. Number two, Walter Kasper's about face on dual covenant theology in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in March. And number three, the American bishops removing the heretical statement that the Mosaic covenant is eternally valid from their catechism in August of this year. The rest is up to us. Do we continue to hold on to outmoded secular premises, which are in many cases nothing more than elaborate rationalizations of misbehavior? The bait is always the same. As Aldous Huxley pointed out in the 1930s in Means and Ends, men become revolutionaries largely because they want sexual liberation. In overthrowing the moral law, they pave the way for their own bondage to those who are the masters of revolutionary movement throughout history. Do we have the courage to separate ourselves from this failed movement? If we do have the courage, how do we go about doing this? The answer to that question is by embracing Logos as fully as possible. Logos is the mind of God, Logos is Christ, and Christ is the Logos made flesh. We are now engaged in a battle which has ebbed and flowed over the centuries, but the sides in this battle have not changed. What has changed are the odds. The revolutionary Jews and their allies have never been stronger. The Catholics, as the standard bearers of the best, have never been weaker. But the outcome of spiritual battles and the battle for the soul of the West, as Tolkien knew, is a spiritual battle, no matter what the odds, is rarely predictable. If St. Paul, representing the Christian position, has to say, when I am weak, I am strong, then the revolutionary Jew, representing the opposite position, has to say, when I am strong, I am weak. We are outgunned on every front in the culture wars, but that is no reason for despair if we follow the logos that St. Paul followed, because he was outgunned by the Jews in his time too, outgunned but not undone, saying, we are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed. We have never been weaker, our enemies have never been stronger, but this is no reason for despair, because as Elrond says, this quest may be attempted by the weak with as much hope as the strong. We are weak now, but even if our souls are weak, Logos is strong. Logos is the glue that holds the universe together, and so it is strong enough to unite us in our hobbit-like defense of the West, even if Mordor is now west of the Shire. Whether it be the higher Logos, which acknowledges Christ as the Lord of the universe, or the lower Logos, which honors him by seeing this order in the works of creation or in the moral law, we are the party to Logos. And it is only as such that we can think of surviving, much less of prevailing over our enemies.
Amen.
Thank you very much.